The wind across the Wyoming plains was a sculptor of hard things, carving canyons from stone and patience from men. It was a merciless artist, and it had shaped Caleb Thorne's face into a landscape of grief, all harsh lines and shadowed hollows. His ranch was a testament to survival, a lonely cluster of buildings clinging to the earth like a stubborn weed. Into this kingdom of dust and silence, the stagecoach delivered a mistake. Her name was Abigail, and the letter that preceded her, penned by cruel men in a distant town, had described a woman of delicate frame and demure nature. The woman who now stood before Caleb, her traveling dress coated in a fine red dust, was anything but delicate. She was a woman built of softer, kinder lines than the land around her, a woman whose frame promised resilience and whose eyes held a deep, weary sorrow that Caleb recognized, for it was a mirror to his own. He read the letter again, a crinkling piece of paper that felt like a joke in his calloused hand. He looked from the cruel, mocking words to the woman, and then to the vast, unforgiving emptiness of his land. "There's been a mistake," he said, the words rough as gravel, his voice an instrument unused to kindness. "You can't stay." Abigail didn't flinch, for she had heard those words, or variations of them, her entire life. She merely clutched the handle of her worn satchel, the knuckles of her hand white, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for a place that might finally want her. The wind whipped a strand of her brown hair across her face, a fleeting, gentle touch in a world that offered none. This was the paradox of her arrival, a soft soul delivered unto a hard land, an unwanted kindness at the door of a man who believed he no longer had room for Anya's. Abigail turned, her shoulders slumped with a familiar resignation, a shadow detached itself from the doorway of the ranch house. It was Lily, Caleb's daughter, a wisp of a child with eyes as wide and haunted as a cornered fawn. She was a creature of silence, her voice having been stolen by the same tragedy that had hollowed out her father's soul. She had not willingly approached a stranger in over a year, yet now she moved with a strange, solemn purpose across the dusty yard. She stopped before Abigail, her small hand reaching out, not with the impulsive curiosity of a child, but with the deliberate gravity of a magistrate passing sentence. Her fingers, small and smudged with dirt, closed around a fold of Abigail's heavy skirt. It was not a plea for a toy or a sweet, but a plea for anchorage. Caleb froze, his breath catching in his throat. He watched his daughter, his silent, ghost-like child, tether herself to this stranger. Abigail looked down, her own surprise softening the weary lines around her eyes. She saw the desperation in the child's grip, a silent scream that resonated with the unvoiced loneliness in her own heart. Caleb's throat worked, but no words came out. He had built his world on a foundation of loss, and its rules were simple: trust nothing, feel nothing, let no one in. But his daughter, his precious, broken Lily, was now rewriting those rules with a single, silent gesture. He looked at Abigail, at the unexpected gentleness in her gaze as she looked down at his child, and a crack formed in the stone wall around his heart. "The sun will be down soon," he finally managed to say, his voice still a rasp. One night it was not a welcome, but a concession, a temporary stay against the execution of her departure, and for Abigail, who had expected nothing, it felt like a reprieve. The inside of the ranch house was as stark and guarded as its owner. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of afternoon light, illuminating surfaces long untouched by a gentle hand. A stone fireplace stood cold and black, a hollow mouth in a house that had forgotten the taste of warmth. In the corner, a small photograph on the mantel was shrouded in a veil of dust, the ghost of a smiling woman frozen in time. While Caleb disappeared into the barn, his movement stiff and deliberate, Abigail took a quiet inventory of the neglect. It was not a house of squalor, but of profound sadness. She did not see it as a judgment, but as a wound that needed tending. With a quiet sigh, she tied an apron she tucked in her satchel around her waist and began to work. She did not make a sound, her movements economical and soft. She swept the floor, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a gentle pulse in the silent home. She coaxed a fire to life in the hearth, its crackling song chasing the shadows back into their corners. From her own meager provisions, she found flour, salt, and yeast, and soon the air, once thin and smelling only of dust and old sorrow, began to fill with the rich, wholesome scent of baking bread. When Caleb returned, the setting sun casting his long shadow before him, he stopped in the doorway, arrested. The house was transformed. The air was warm, alive with the smell of food. Lily sat at the rough-hewn table, not hiding in her room, and she was watching Abigail knead dough with a look of silent fascination. For a moment, Caleb felt a disorienting sense of temporal displacement, as if he had stepped back in time to a life he had buried. He said nothing, but his eyes followed Abigail's every move, his suspicion warring with a nascent, unfamiliar feeling that felt dangerously like hope. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Abigail's one night bled into 2, then a week, the arrangement sealed not by words but by a shared, reluctant inertia. Caleb never officially invited her to stay, and she never asked. Her presence simply became a fact, like the rising of the sun or the ceaseless blowing of the wind. She understood that Lily was her passport in this land of sorrow, and she honored that bond with a reverence born of her own deep-seated need for connection. She never pressured the child to speak, sensing that Lily's silence was a fragile shield, a fortress built to protect a wound too raw to be exposed to the world. Instead, Abigail spoke the language of gentle action. She would sit beside Lily on the porch steps for an hour, humming a soft tune while she mended one of the girl's worn dresses, the needle and thread a quiet whisper of care. She showed her how to press wildflowers between the pages of a book, creating a secret garden of color and beauty. They communicated through shared tasks, passing clothespins back and forth as they hung laundry on the line, their hands occasionally brushing, a fleeting touch that conveyed more than 1,000 words. Caleb would watch them from a distance, often from the shadowed doorway of the barn, his expression unreadable. His own interactions with Abigail remained clipped and functional. The hens need feeding, there's a tear in my shirt yet, his actions began to betray the thaw happening within him. One evening, finding Abigail asleep in a chair by the dying fire, a book having slipped from her lap, he paused, then gently draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders before retreating back into the shadows, his heart pounding with a feeling he had long since forgotten. The silence of the Thorn Ranch was heavy, saturated with unspoken histories that clung to the very timbers of the house. The narrator's voice could give shape to these ghosts, painting a picture of the lives that converged in this lonely place. Abigail had spent her life as an apology, her gentle nature and generous heart overlooked because of a frame that society deemed imperfect. She had been the object of cruel jokes and pitying glances, her spirit slowly eroded until she answered the mail-order bride advertisement as a final, desperate gamble for a place to belong. Caleb's history was sharper, a single, jagged event that had cleaved his life in 2. He had once been a man who laughed, a man whose love for his wife, Sarah, was as vast and open as the sky. But a single afternoon, an overturned wagon, a tragic accident down by the creek, that was the official story he told himself and the world. The truth, he suspected, was something far more sinister, a truth he was too cowardly to face. His guilt was a physical weight, a constant companion that had turned him to stone. And at the epicenter of this shared grief was Lily. She was the sole witness to that terrible day, and whatever she saw had stolen her voice, locking the horror deep inside her. The approaching winter storm, gathering its dark, bruised clouds on the horizon, was a perfect mirror for the tempest brewing within the 3 of them. It was a physical manifestation of the unresolved pain, the buried secrets, and the violent truth that was slowly, inevitably, making its way back to them across the desolate plains, a harbinger of a reckoning that none of them were prepared for. One afternoon, while searching for extra linens in a large, dust-covered steamer trunk at the foot of Caleb's bed, Abigail's fingers brushed against something cold and hard tucked beneath a stack of yellowed quilts. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age and neglect. Her curiosity piqued, she worked the delicate clasp with her thumbnail until it sprang open. Inside, there was not a portrait of Caleb or Lily, but a faded, miniature photograph of a handsome, smiling man she didn't recognize. On the other side, a tiny lock of dark hair was pressed beneath the glass. It was clearly a cherished memento, but it didn't seem to belong to the story of a devoted wife. Deeper in the trunk, she found something else, a man's work shirt, neatly folded but for a single, jagged tear near the collar, and on the cuff, a dark, reddish-brown stain that had not washed out. It wasn't Caleb's. It was too small, the fabric of a finer quality than his rough-spun garments. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The story of a simple wagon accident felt thin, a threadbare blanket thrown over a much larger, more monstrous shape. That evening, as the first winds of the storm began to rattle the window panes, she approached Caleb. She didn't speak, but simply opened her hand, revealing the locket on her palm. His face went pale, a mask of shock and something that looked like fear. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper, the air crackling with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. "In the trunk," she answered softly. With a torn shirt he stared at the locket as if it were a venomous snake, the past uncoiling at his feet, ready to strike. The storm broke with the fury of a vengeful god, unleashing a torrent of wind and rain that turned the world outside into a churning, grey chaos. The windows rattled in their frames and the wind shrieked through the eaves, a mournful cry that seemed to amplify the suffocating tension inside the small cabin. They were prisoners of the storm, trapped together with the ghosts Abigail had unearthed. And then, a sound that cut through the gale, a frantic, desperate pounding on the front door. Caleb grabbed his rifle from its rack above the mantel, his movements sharp with alarm. He cracked the door open, the wind tearing it from his grasp and slamming it against the interior wall. A figure stumbled inside, cloaked in a drenched oilskin, his face hidden by the brim of a sodden hat. "Caleb!" "Thank the Lord," the man said, his voice a smooth, familiar baritone that made the hairs on Caleb's neck stand on end. The man pushed back his hat, revealing the handsome, smiling face from the locket. It was Marcus, a ranch hand Caleb had fired the week before Sarah's death, a man who had vanished without a trace. "My horse threw a shoe miles back," Marcus said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Thought this storm would be the end of me." His gaze slid past Caleb, landing on Abigail with a look of predatory appraisal, before finally settling on Lily, who had shrunk back into the darkest corner of the room, her small body trembling uncontrollably. The air in the room grew thick and cold, the friendly reunion a flimsy facade for something ancient and predatory that had just been invited in from the storm. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted familiar shapes into monstrous forms. Marcus sat at the table, nursing a cup of coffee Abigail had reluctantly given him, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He spoke of his travels, weaving tales with a practiced, easy charm, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing the changes in the house, lingering on Abigail, on Lily, on the rifle now resting against Caleb's chair. "You've made some changes around here, Thorne," Marcus said, his tone casual, but edged with something sharp. "Got yourself a new woman." Sturdier model than the last 1 inch. Caleb's hand tightened into a fist on the table, his knuckles white. "Don't you talk about her," he growled. Marcus chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, Sarah? She was a talker. Always talking about her dreams. Leaving this dusty scrap of land. Find a real man," she said. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She said you were weak. Couldn't even fix that busted wheel on the wagon right. If you'd done it properly, she'd probably still be here." Each word was a poisoned dart, aimed at the heart of Caleb's deepest guilt. He was baiting him, enjoying the torment. As Marcus spoke, Lily began to make a small, whimpering sound from her corner, a noise of pure terror. Marcus's smile widened as he looked at her. "What's wrong, little bird? Cat got your tongue?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden bird, holding it up. "Remember this? I made it for you. Right before your mama took her little trip down to the creek." In that moment, the dam of silence in Lily's mind shattered. Her eyes, wide with horror, were fixed on Marcus. A sound tore from her throat, raw and full of a year's worth of compressed terror. "Monster," she screamed, the single word an explosion that ripped through the cabin, a verdict and an accusation all in one. The world seemed to hang suspended on the echo of that single, powerful word. Monster for Caleb, it was as if a lightning bolt had struck the room, illuminating the dark, twisted truth he had refused to see. The torn shirt. The locket. The fear in Lily's eyes. It all slammed into place. Marcus had not just been there, he had been the cause. The wagon accident was a lie he had told himself because the truth was too terrible to bear. A primal roar of fury and grief ripped from Caleb's lungs as he launched himself across the table. The flimsy furniture splintered under their combined weight as they crashed to the floor. It was not a fight, it was an exorcism. Caleb, no longer the stoic, grieving man, was a force of pure, protective rage, his fists striking with the weight of a year's worth of repressed pain. Marcus, caught off guard by the sudden violence, fought back with a snake's viciousness, his charming facade stripped away to reveal the cold-blooded killer beneath. As they grappled on the floor, the storm outside raging in concert with the violence within, Abigail acted on pure instinct. She swept Lily into her arms, shielding the terrified child with her own body, turning her away from the brutal spectacle and whispering reassurances, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos. The fight was short and brutal. Fueled by a father's love and a husband's vengeance, Caleb subdued Marcus, his hand closing around the man's throat, silencing the poison that had haunted his family for so long. When it was over, the cabin fell into a profound silence, broken only by the sound of Caleb's ragged breathing and Lily's quiet sobs against Abigail's shoulder. The ghost of the past had been violently expelled, leaving behind a wreckage that offered the first, painful chance at a new beginning. The spring that followed the great storm was a season of quiet rebirth. The harsh winds gave way to gentle breezes that carried the scent of sagebrush and new life across the plains. The land itself seemed to be healing, and so did the three souls who called it home. The shadow of Marcus was gone, handed over to a justice that felt far less significant than the justice Caleb had delivered on his own floor. In the aftermath, the silence in the house transformed. It was no longer a heavy shroud of grief, but a comfortable, shared quietude, punctuated by the small sounds of a family being built. Lily's voice, once uncaged, began to fill the empty spaces. First with single words, then tentative phrases, and soon, with the bright, melodic laughter of a child who was finally safe. She followed Abigail everywhere, a small, devoted shadow, her hand often tucked securely into the older woman's. The bond between Caleb and Abigail was forged in that same quiet space, built not on grand declarations, but on small, meaningful gestures. A cup of coffee left for him on the porch rail at sunrise. A wildflower she found tucked into the saddlebag of his horse. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and gold, Lily asleep inside, Caleb reached over and took Abigail's hand. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "You stayed," he said, the two words holding the weight of 1,000 unsent letters, 100 unspoken thank yous. Abigail's fingers curled around his. "You let me," she replied, her voice soft. And in that simple exchange, a new story was written, a story of how a cruel joke led to an unlikely sanctuary, and how a family, broken by tragedy, was made whole again not by blood, but by the stubborn, resilient power of love. The story of Abigail, Caleb, and Lily serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes, our deepest wounds are the very things that make room for the greatest healing. It shows us that a home is not just for walls, but the safe harbor we find in the hearts of others, and that family is a choice we make every single day. If their journey from sorrow to sunshine touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and the incredible resilience of the human spirit.